City. This is Charlie Rose.
We begin this evening with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. He is in New York attending the United Nations General Assembly meeting. I spoke with him yesterday at his hotel about his perspective on the Middle East. Today, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly. Here is some of what he said.
I stand here today as the Prime Minister of Israel, the Jewish state, and I speak to you on behalf of my country and my people. The United Nations was founded after the carnage of World War II, after the horrors of the Holocaust. It was charged with preventing the reoccurrence of such horrendous events. Nothing has undermined that mission, nothing has impeded it more than the systematic assault on the truth. Yesterday, the President of Iran stood at this very podium, spewing his latest anti-Semitic rants. Just a few days earlier, he again claimed that the Holocaust is a lie. I'm proud that my country, Israel, is at the forefront of many of these advances in science and technology, in medicine and biology, in agriculture and water, in energy and the environment. These innovations in my country and many of your countries offer humanity a sunlit future of unimagined promise. But if the most primitive fanaticism can acquire the most deadly weapons, the march of history could be reversed for a time. And like the belated victory over the Nazis, the forces of progress and freedom, they will prevail only after an horrific toll of blood and fortune has been exacted for mankind. This is why the greatest threat facing the world today is the marriage between religious fundamentalism and the weapons of mass destruction. The most urgent challenge facing this body today is to prevent the tyrants of Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Are the members of the United Nations up to that challenge? Will the international community confront a despotism that terrorizes its own people as they bravely stand up for freedom? Will it take action against the dictators who stole an election in broad daylight and then gunned down Iranian protesters who died in the sidewalks on the street choking in their own blood? Will the international community thwart the world's most pernicious sponsor and practitioner of terrorism? Above all, will the international community stop the terrorist regime of Iran from developing atomic weapons, thereby endangering the peace of the entire world? The people of Iran are courageously standing up to this regime. People of goodwill around the world stand with them, as do thousands of people who've been protesting and demonstrating outside this hall all of this week. Will the United Nations stand by their side? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the jury is still out on the United Nations.
And here's the conversation that I had with the Prime Minister yesterday at his hotel here in New York. First of all, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for taking this time to see us.
Good to see you again, Charlie.
Good to see
you.
you.
It's been a long time.
It has.
We don't want to say how long.
Well, let me just touch on that. You've been out of power.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see Israeli issues, Israeli-Palestinian issues, Israeli-Arab issues different, having spent 10 years away?
Sure. I see everything different. How? Well, you get older, grayer, probably, I'd like to think, wiser. And you think about what it is that you can do to make a lasting impact, a difference. And you know, it takes at least two to tango in this particular dance. But if we see a Palestinian leadership that is as committed to peace as the late Anwar Sadat of Egypt or the late King Hussein of Jordan were, then they will see in me as committed an Israeli leader for peace as were the late Menachem Begin and the late Yitzhak Rabin. We're waiting for a real peace partner.
Waiting to do what?
Make peace. And peace means that you have to have a basic reciprocity. And the question is really, what is the basic problem? You know, people think it's settlements, it's territories. Yeah, these are all problems that have to be resolved. But remember, this battle against Zionism and then the State of Israel raged for 50 years until you had the first settlement. And the question is, from the 1920s right up to 67. We left all of Lebanon, we left every square inch of Gaza, and still they fire rockets into what they say is occupied Palestine, Beersheba, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Haifa, and so on, from the north and from the south. So I asked the Palestinians a very simple question. Suppose we solve these problems, settlements, borders, territories.
Jerusalem.
Will you then, every one of these problems, I want to know a simple question. Will you recognize the State of Israel? Jerusalem had been divided and they conducted a war against us for 50 years. Will you recognize the State of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people? You ask me and my people to recognize the Palestinian state as the nation state of the Palestinian people. Will you recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people? And the answer ought to be very simple. Yes.
But you know the reason they don't do that.
Why do you think they don't do that, if I can switch rules for a
I would
second?
think demographics and who you would define as eligible to vote and things like that.
I think it's not that reason. I think that the Palestinian society is bifurcated. On the white side are the Hamas and the other, the other extreme groups that openly say, we want to destroy the State of Israel. They fire thousands of rockets into our territory. They make no bones about it. On the other side are the more moderate faction. And they say, well, we're not espousing terror and we're doing other things, but they don't really say it's over. They don't say, well, we'll get the state and we cease the conflict, cease all claims against Israel, we make a permanent peace with the Jewish state. Because for many of them, there is a subtext. And the subtext is, we get a state not to end the conflict, but to perpetuate the conflict for better terms. And then we ask to flood Israel with the refugees and their offspring. That nullifies the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. Or we make irredentist claims on the Negev and the Galilee. And I say, look, I want to join this issue. I want to join this issue because this is where the guts, the soul of the Israeli people is. Everybody wants to make peace. There's a desire, a hunger for peace that is fantastic. But the same...
That is the will of the Israeli people and that is the will of the Palestinian people.
You know what you have in Israel? I think this is an interesting statistic. About 70–80% of Israelis will say we're willing to make concessions to a genuine peace. And about the same 80% say, but there's no one to make the concessions to. Because they want an answer. They want to know that the Palestinian side will cease the conflict once we have a peace agreement. That the state will not be a springboard for future attacks. So when I put forward this question of recognizing a Jewish state, not in the religious sense, obviously Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people, and there are non-Jews there. The Arab Israelis are citizens like everyone else. They vote in the Knesset, they participate in the government and so on. They have equal rights, it's not a question. But the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, go to the Palestinian state, just as the Jewish refugees from Arab lands went into Israel. And there are no more claims. And I think this is a substantive point. This is the heart of the conflict. This conflict has been perpetuated for so many decades because of a persistent refusal to recognize the Jewish state in any boundaries. And that's why I put this front and forward. When I made a speech, and it wasn't easy for me. And I said, we'll recognize a Palestinian state. But we asked that the Palestinians recognize the Jewish state, which ought to be a fairly simple exercise. And I think that's what they're grappling with.
What do you think their problem with the words Jewish state is?
I think it means the end of any claims, irredentist claims on Israel, on the Negev or on the Galilee, where you have a sizable Arab minority. I think it also means that that there won't be this inflood of refugees, Palestinian refugees and their descendants into Israel. Because if either one of them happens, Israel as a Jewish state ceases to exist. And I think it ought to be simple to say, 100 years after, more than 100 years after Herzl published his great manifesto, The Jewish State, and after President Obama today, yesterday, I suppose it would be in your time, said we need to recognize the Jewish state. We recognize the Jewish state. It ought to be a fairly simple exercise for the Palestinian moderates, not Hamas, to say that.
Was that language you urged the president to use?
I've been speaking about it for a time, but I haven't urged. It's not the president of the United States who has to be urged. It's the president of the Palestinian Authority. And I think Mr. Abbas has to decide, is he an Arafat or a King Hussein or an Anwar Sadat? I mean, is he on the side of these last two great leaders who stood up and said, it's over?
And what
or is he wobbling?
Fair enough. And what do you have to decide? What kind of leader are you? No.
Well, that will be tested, will it?
A Menachem Begin who was willing to do what he had done with Anwar Sadat?
Anytime.
Ariel Sharon, who was willing to withdraw from settlements?
Well, Ariel Sharon unilaterally withdrew.
Exactly.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Because it ought to be negotiated. Because you ought to get something from it.
Because you want a stable peace on the other side of the fence. You don't want another Hamastan, another Iranian base on the territory that you vacate. So there are really two conditions for peace, not for starting peace negotiations. I place no preconditions on them. But I think there are real, clear terms for a successful resolution of the negotiations once started. One is recognition. The Palestinians have to recognize the Jewish state just as we're asked and are prepared to recognize a Palestinian state. What kind of a leader am I? I'm the one, a Likud leader, who stood before his own people, his own party, and said that just a few months ago.
I know, but
second, it has to be a demilitarized Palestinian state. It can't be a platform for for thousands of rockets that are then rained on our heads. And signing a piece of paper by itself doesn't guarantee that. It has to be a solid security.
And Israel has to control the borders, you said,
Mm-hmm.
and airspace. Israel will control the airspace too. I mean, there are many Palestinians and others beyond that, who say that the state that you proposed for them was hardly a state.
Why? Why is that?
Well, they said because they wouldn't control the airspace, they wouldn't control the borders. They would not have had. They had to be totally demilitarized.
Of course. No. Of course they have to be demilitarized. I mean, Israel is tiny. You know how tiny it is?
Yeah, but Israel is strong, both in terms of its military and in terms of its idea.
Charlie, I agree.
And Yitzhak Rabin once said to me,
I agree we're strong.
Exactly.
Yeah, but we can move from great strength to extreme vulnerability in a heartbeat. And this is our problem. You know why? Because we're so small. Now, if you're a small country like Monaco or Luxembourg...
The distance from there to you is tiny.
Well, no, just take a country like Belgium or Luxembourg or Monaco. They're small. That doesn't make them insecure. But if they're surrounded by neighbors who not only call for their destruction, but rain 12,000 rockets into that tiny country, you think we have a real problem. Now, these rockets that land, think of that. 10,000, 12,000 rockets falling on the United States that is compressed to the size of New Jersey. That would make you think about
and
security.
No leader would want that to happen.
Right?
And no leader would stand by while that was happening. None.
Now,
On the other hand,
what
the
would
question,
guarantee that?
Well, that's an interesting question. Is how do you define your security and how you get to the place where you are more secure in your strength than you are even today? And that is helping to see a strong Palestinian entity. And you agree with that?
Yes, I do, and I've been acting on it.
You agree with that, and you're trying to do something about that.
Not only are we doing it, I think that involves a third leg. I mean, peace stands on three legs. One is recognition,
Right.
which is really another word for legitimacy.
Okay. But the Arab nations all are prepared. All the Arab, when you're talking about the Palestinians, but all the Arab nations are prepared to recognize you. You know that from the Arab Initiative.
Well, President Obama said something quite significant today.
What did he say?
He said, and I think he was alluding to this. Now, this is my interpretation, but I think it's a fairly accurate one. He said to the Arab world, you know, it's time to speak out in the open what you say privately. You know, we have a common threat, Iran, and we have a common desired peace. You can't just whisper it in the corridors, you know, quietly. You have to come out and act on it and normalize the relations with Israel. So number one, legitimacy. Number two, security. Number three, and this is what you were asking, prosperity. I think it makes a tremendous difference if young Palestinians have jobs, careers, if as hope as you drive on the road from Tel Aviv. We have two roads, one closer to the Palestinian areas. You drive from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. On your right, Jerusalem. On your left, you see Ramallah. And if you see sprouting from the ground, not rockets, but gleaming apartment buildings and office blocks, that makes a tremendous difference for Palestinians. And Charlie, it makes a tremendous difference for Israelis, because they believe something else is possible. So for the last 6 months, even though we had no talks, and unilaterally, it's my decision, we've removed...
For the last 6 months of no talks, and...
We've removed unilaterally, hundreds of roadblocks, earth ramps, checkpoints. We had 147 checkpoints. We reduced it to 14. They work around the clock so we don't impede. I went to the Jordan River Bridge, the Allenby Bridge, connecting the West Bank to the rest of the Arab world. And I said, we'll extend the passage on this bridge. I want goods, services, people, trucks to pass back and forth to the West Bank economy. People said there, well, we can't do it, Prime Minister. We don't have the budget. I said, you have the budget. Just do it. We've extended times on the bridge. We're dealing with, I personally chair a committee, a ministerial committee, to unclog all sorts of bureaucratic hurdles to investment projects in the Palestinian areas. I check sewage, electricity. I want to know why these projects are not being moved by our side. If they have impediments on their side, that's a different matter. That's what I do, because I believe in this. I believe that prosperity helps peace. We used to think that peace will bring prosperity. I tend to think it may be, in some cases, the other way around, that prosperity brings peace, or at least creates the conditions for the political process to succeed. And I think that there's something different going on in the West Bank.
You're beginning to sound like Shimon Peres.
No, what's wrong with that? He's a very, very good friend. You know, we've known each other a long time, and I think...
But that's the central idea that he's articulated for a long time. But here's another question about the politics. How much freedom do you have? You talk about, you're saying you want a budget, you got a budget. You need people to do this, we're going to withdraw. I'm the Prime Minister, I'm willing to take this chance. But others worry about this coalition you have. And they worry about how much maneuverability you have to do the things that you may very well want to, because you had to put together people who might have a different idea about Israel's security, Israel's destiny, and the way to get there. And also about the plight of Palestinians.
I think there's actually a much bigger consensus in Israel, which I tried to express in a speech I gave at Bar-Ilan University, and I was amazed at the response. I mean, amazed. I sat for...
Amazing in what way? Because of what you said?
Because I said that what we really need is that peace with the Palestinians will consist of a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the Jewish state. That's, in a nutshell, what I said. The response was overwhelming. I mean, this cut across, you know, skip the center. I mean, cut across the right and the left. I'm not talking about the extreme fringes. They'll never be satisfied. And I think this expresses this yearning for peace, and also the basic two conditions of recognition and security that Israelis would coalesce around. And Israelis are very generous people if they believe there's a Sadat on the other side, a King Hussein on the other side. And I hope that we'll encounter such such leadership. But you ask, what did I learn? I learned two things. One is unity. I always said, you talk about Shimon Peres, people said to me, what is the biggest mistake that you made in your first term as Prime Minister?
Good question.
Well, you may have asked me that, I'm not
did.
sure. And I may have told you, because I believed it. I said, I think the biggest mistake was not turning to Shimon Peres, who was the leader of labor at the time, and saying, let's join hands, let's form a government of national unity for the purpose of peace and security. Well, I didn't just say it. That's exactly what I did now. I turned to Ehud Barak, who's the head of the Labor Party, and I said, let's join hands for the sake of peace and security. I think if Israel is to make peace, it will make peace only from a position where the great body of people are convinced that they'll have security and they'll have a partner on the other side that recognizes
and that
the state of Israel.
And that includes your foreign minister? You'd say the same thing to him that you said to Ehud Barak?
I say the same thing to everyone.
And does he respond in the same way that Ehud Barak does? Because there is the question as to whether there are two very different views of the destiny of Israel.
I think they want proof. They all want proof. They're all willing to go a great distance, but they want to be sure, because the margins of our existence are so fragile. Understand what it means to get dozens of missiles. How about thousands of missiles? They don't just rain on our population, on our cities. That's bad enough. I mean, no one has been subjected to this other than Britain in World War II.
No one denies that either.
Well, the second point is, Charlie, that if we miss out, most of the rockets, close to 95% of the rockets that are hurled against Israel are hurled from adjacent territories, nearby territories. And they're hurled at our cities, which is an unbelievable problem, but they can also be hurled at our air bases, at critical installations for our defense. So if we blow it, if we make the wrong judgment,
and that would be creating a state that has the potential to do that as a state. That
becomes an Iranian enclave. Now, here's what happened. Sharon, whom you mentioned, whom I greatly respect, a great leader, there's no question about it. But Sharon decided...
A man who grew and evolved in his ideas about public policy.
No question about it. But I disagreed with him when he unilaterally walked out of Gaza. And I said, Arik, this will be a platform from which rockets will be fired on Ashkelon, and I said Beersheba and Ashdod.
And you simply wanted to negotiate and create a way to prevent that from happening
as you turned it over. Unless we had some arrangements, I said Hamas would take over. I coined the term Hamastan. Now look at what happened. We vacated this territory. Iran essentially walked in with its Hamas proxy, and they're packing a lot of missiles. They fired rockets into Israel. We walked out of Lebanon, and Iran walked in with its Hezbollah proxy, and they fired thousands of rockets into the north of Israel. The last thing we want is to walk away from the West Bank or pieces of the West Bank and have Iran come in and place thousands more rockets on Tel Aviv.
And so the only way you can do that is to say, we'll take a Palestinian state and respect it if they'll recognize us as a Jewish state, and they'll be demilitarized.
Well, demilitarization is critical for peace, because the only peace that will endure is a peace you can defend. But if you can't defend the peace, it's not going to hold.
First of all, I don't understand why it took you a long time to come to the idea that a two-state solution was a good idea. Why did it take you until that speech, after the president spoke in Cairo, to go that far, which you now point as something that was very difficult for me, and it took a certain courage for me, and it resonated with everybody?
It resonated the way I said it, because I put those basic stipulations that Israelis agree with. I have not said that I would go back to the 67 boundaries.
Well, it's not specific, but with some changes.
I want Jerusalem as a united city under Israel, and I will not accept refugees, because I think there's an
Are those items non-negotiable, or like most negotiations, you'll say, these are my principles, this is what I believe in, but let's talk and see where we can get.
Well, look, they'll raise their positions, we'll raise ours, and we'll differ, I guarantee you. But I think that the most important thing you asked is, why did I raise it? Well, I've been talking about this for quite some time. I said, look, the Palestinians in a final settlement should have all the powers to govern themselves, except those handful of powers that could threaten the state of Israel. I've been saying this for years. Yes, it takes time.
But this speech was the first time, and some say you felt like you had to respond to the fact that the President of the United States in Cairo had spoken to the region in a dramatic way.
Well, you didn't sit in the inter-cabinet discussions that we had well before the Cairo speech.
Not because I wouldn't like to.
Yeah, well, I know a lot of people. So here's what I'll tell you. What I said. I don't want to talk about others,
Yeah.
but I said this, and I've said this on other occasions too. I said, look, what are we going to do with the Palestinians? We don't want them as citizens of Israel, but we don't want them as our subjects either. So they have to govern themselves. Why is it that we, aside from the territorial question, which is subject obviously to negotiation, why is it that we wouldn't want them to govern themselves? And the only answer, the real answer to that is we do want them to govern themselves,
Well, I mean,
except for the problem of security. So is it possible to conceive of arrangements where this issue is taken care of? And if you look around the world, you'll see various ideas of sovereignty. For example, economic sovereignty isn't absolute in many places. It's not absolute. You know that. You know, there are international institutions that limit your sovereignty. I've been reading up on this a great deal, and I don't want to bore you with the. First of all, it has awful jargon.
I understand, but I mean, a lot of people have said that this is
straightforwardly.
You know, that what the Palestinians would end up with under your conditions would be a far less sovereignty than any nation ought to have.
Why does Palestinian self-determination require that they have rockets and missiles and tanks and artillery to threaten us? Why? I see no reason for that, and especially given the dimensions, the proximity to our cities, the tiny dimensions. Israel is so tiny that, as I said, it can move from great strength to great vulnerability overnight. You say, well, yeah, but you'll have a peace agreement. Yeah, peace agreements, a lot of peace agreements have been shredded to bits.
No, what I say is it's in your best interest to build up the Palestinian state.
I think
so that they can partake of economic prosperity.
Correct.
You know, but I'm just asking questions. I have no policy.
Well, you know, that's a refreshing change from many of the some of the journalists that I've encountered.
All right.
It's pretty good.
On this program, that Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Salam Fayyad, which a lot of people have praised because of some of the things he is saying, said to me he wants to, even without a state, build up the Palestinian community
Or state.
in a way that when a statehood becomes, it'll be anticlimactic because they will have self-governing institutions. They will be able to, and so Israel cannot say we don't have a bargaining partner. They will have already shown you that they were capable. Do you buy into what he's saying? Do you believe that he's on the right track? And you believe that's possible? And do you say to him, I'll do everything I can to help you achieve that goal?
I've been saying it to him by my actions. I mean, I think we've undergone a fundamental change, very dramatic change that the President alluded to today yesterday in a speech in the UN.
Speaking of that.
Well, today, as we speak.
Right.
And I'll tell you, if they build institutions of governance and they have a prosperous economy, the Palestinians, and of course have security forces that deal with terrorism. You don't need armies to deal with it. It's fairly straightforward and simple. These things are good, and these things are things that we want to see happening. Because, in fact, what happened is it didn't happen in Gaza. We left Gaza unilaterally, and overnight the Hamas kicked out the Palestinian Authority and established basically an Iranian enclave there that has been used as a terror base against us.
But as you know, the Palestinian Authority and Fatah have been doing better.
Sure.
And have shown some real
good
progress.
We encourage it and we support it.
With respect to the president, you met the president, President Obama, before he became president. Yeah. And I want to confirm this, you basically said to somebody, this could be another president of the United States. This could be a future president.
Well, I'll tell you, we had a meeting. Our first meeting was in Washington National Airport, in the airport in Washington, D.C. I had come to a visit to the United States, and he was on the campaign trail. It was early on in the campaign.
You're a private citizen then?
I was the head of the opposition.
Okay.
And the only place we could meet was in I think in a sort of a custodian's office there, or a janitor's office. He came. He was only running for the President of the United States, so he came with one person. I, being the head of the great empire called Israel, I had 5 aides. 4 of them had either been born or spent a lot of time in the United States. And we had the meeting. after the Arabs meeting, we parted. And I said, I think he's going to be the next president. And
now, why'd you say that?
Well, I'll tell you what my aides said. They said, look, it's true you spent time in the United States, but you weren't born here. And you're wrong. These are my aides who are otherwise experts in great things, and believe me, they got
yes.
Why did I say
Except
that?
American politics.
Because I felt he had special capacities, great capacities that I thought would propel him to where he eventually got.
You have quoted him as saying, I come from the left to the center, you come from the right to the center, and we're both practical and pragmatic men.
He said people attribute to think that we carry a lot more ideological baggage than we actually do. We have to, at the end of the day, leaders have to come up with pragmatic solutions to complex problems. And I said, I agree with that.
Okay. Tell me, when you come from an illustrious family, your father goes back to, the creation of the State of Israel.
It goes back 100 years. He's going to celebrate his 100th birthday in a few months.
Exactly. And with a very strong sense of what Israel's destiny is.
He just visited New York. He visited New York. I called him up the other day and I said, how are you, Dad? And he said, well, I can't talk to you now. That struck me as odd. He usually likes to talk to me. And I said, why? He said, well, I'm packing. I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to New York City. I said, you what?
And you didn't know?
No, I didn't. But he left that night and he came back a week later. He's very active. He's writing.
Okay. Coming from that, what influence did he have on you about Israel and about Israel's destiny and about Israel's place and about what Israel had to do to build its national security and build its institutions and build its opportunity?
Well, he had obviously, both my parents, my mother and my father, had obviously a very strong influence on me, as did my older brother.
Right.
But it's not only on me. I mean, what has shaped all of us is the great experience of the Jewish people in the 20th century, this transformation from utter powerlessness, where we didn't control it. We were like a wind-tossed leaf. I was in Berlin the other day and I visited the Wannsee Villa, a suburb of Berlin where the Nazis met in January of 1942 and decided in a few hours to destroy the Jewish people, the final solution. The invitation reads, by Heydrich, Himmler's deputy, the head of the SS, you are cordially invited to a discussion of the final solution of the Jewish people. After breakfast, they say breakfast will be served. And they ate breakfast, a hearty breakfast. Then they discussed this for several hours. Nobody batted an eyelash. They drank cognac and they decided to exterminate the Jewish people, my people, and they did. That was our condition. And the State of Israel was established to change that condition so that we can govern our destiny, so that we may still have anti-Semitism, the raging fires of hatred of the Jewish people raging around us. But for the first time in many, many centuries, the Jews would have the power to defend themselves in the form of the United Nations, that is against the moral attacks, which I will do tomorrow, and defend themselves physically. And that, yes, that was impressed on me by my parents, but believe me, it was impressed on every Jew in Israel by their parents and their grandparents, and the collective experience of changing the fate of the Jewish people. That is a profound transformation which I'm deeply aware of, that we live in a privileged generation where the Jews can once again decide the Jewish fate. This has not been available for us for close to 2,000 years.
So what is the destiny of Israel? Your father believed, your brother believed, and you believe. What is that destiny?
It's to ingather the exiles in the Jewish homeland and to have a vibrant, progressive, and advanced Jewish state that is a beacon to mankind in so many areas, in medicine and technology and everything else. that we're forging new paths to and living at peace with our Palestinian neighbors. You asked me, why is this so hard? Why was it hard for me? You know why?
Why?
Because of the deep attachment that we have to this land. You know, this is our homeland. It's not a foreign land.
But they don't view it that way either.
No, I understand that, but understand that I recognize that 1.5 million Palestinians live in the heart of the heartland of my homeland. And we have to come to a solution with them, a practical solution that they can live in dignity as a free people and that we can do the same. The land on which they live is not a strange colonial faraway place. I mean, I have a way to express that to people. They come into my office, the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem, and I say, look, here's a photograph, an enlarged photograph of a seal, a ring that was found next to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. It's 2,700 years old. It has a name of the official on it. It's in Hebrew. I can read it. That name is Netanyahu. Netanyahu ben Yoash, Netanyahu the son of Yoash. My first name, Benjamin, goes back earlier. It's about 3,500 years old. You know the story of Benjamin in the Bible.
Right.
They walked on these same hills. These hills, you know, this is where the prophets of Israel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, David, the kings of Israel, David, Solomon, this is not strange land. So on the one hand, our attachment to this land is extremely deep, probably deeper than you can find, well, as deep as any nation that exists.
Can you imagine that the Palestinians feel the same way?
I can
that
imagine.
They feel the same depth of passion and commitment to land, security, and a place to...
Because of that, this, you asked me, why is it hard? It's hard. So the question is, how do you balance our ancestral attachment to this land? After all, we came back, you know, out of, we've done something no people has ever done. We've broken the laws of history and come back out of life. Toynbee said that, no, couldn't happen. The Jews are a fossilized nation. You know, they can't come back to life. It'll never happen. Well, we're here. Toynbee is on the shelves, but we're here, alive and kicking. And the main thing right now is we want to establish this peace with the Palestinians who have their own desires and their own aspirations. So there has to be a compromise there. And while we're ready to compromise, and I think the Israelis, you know, Zionism and Israel have shown repeated willingness to compromise. From the 1920s through the partition plan in 1948, which divided the state into a Jewish, the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. We were ready to do that. We gave back the Sinai. We got out of Gaza. I made an arrangement in Hebron. We had the Wye River Agreement. We have shown a consistent willingness to compromise, even though it's very painful for us to do it. And I'm asking now for the Palestinians to come and say, we're going to compromise too. Yes, Israel, the Jewish state, will live here in this land forever. It's not going to disappear. It's not going to dissolve. We're not going to find a way to get rid of it and cleverly drive the Jews to the sea by demography or any other means. Can they say that? Because we have consistently shown that willingness, and I want them to show it. Arafat didn't.
Well,
will Abbas do it? Let's find out.
You don't know whether Abbas will do that or not. Is that what you're saying?
I think the same kind of, you know, I think the international community in many ways has pampered the Palestinians because it's not put that question to them. It's taken
And the question it has not put to them is, are you prepared to recognize
the Jewish state, Israel as the nation state of the Jews?
Correct me if I'm wrong. You weren't talking about this 10 years ago, were you? The Jewish state and the idea of recognizing the Jewish state?
No, I think because the more I thought about it, I said, what is the problem here? You know, everybody focuses on the question of the territories taken by Israel in 1967, but that's the result of the Arab aggression against us. It's not its cause. And what has happened is a subtle transformation, that the results of these attacks against Israel have been turned into their cause. Yet every time we vacated territory, as in Gaza or elsewhere, you know, the war continues against us with a promise to liberate Israel, quote, liberate Palestine, which is construed as Israel in any place, in any size, any boundary. And I thought we should get to the heart of this issue. Ask the Palestinians this simple question. Force them to confront their own, it's not aspirations, it's a fantasy, that somehow Israel will disappear. It will shrivel and dissolve and disappear.
I don't think that is the desire of most Palestinians. Yes, there are elements in the population. There are also elements in your community who believe that in an idea of a greater Israel, than which there is no respect for Palestinians.
That's right. But
there are extreme thoughts in Palestinian side and the Israeli side.
But the question is, what does the government do? What does the leadership do? And I take your point. I think if maybe the right thing to say is not that Palestinian society is bifurcated. Maybe it's broken into three. One side, obviously, we won't recognize the state of Israel and we'll work to destroy it. The other side says we will recognize the Jewish state, Israel, and live peacefully next to it. And then there's a sort of middle ground. And the middle ground encompasses not all, but some of the political leadership. And they have to be asked to do what the world has been asking us and me to do. Confront this question head on and say, is it going to be over? Will the establishment of a Palestinian state, a demilitarized state, will it be the last demand? Will you make a permanent peace? Will you cease to make demands on other parts of Israel or on the Arab citizens of Israel becoming whatever, a separate state and so on? Many in Israel have questions about it. If you want to know what Israelis think, the overwhelming majority of them, they say, well, when they talk about a two-state solution, they mean one state is Palestine. That's for the Palestinians. No Jews are allowed there. It's sort of Jew-free. And, you know, you can't conceive the Palestinians having Jews living among them. That has to be cleansed. There has to be ethnic cleansing. And then you have the other state, which is a mixed state of Jews and Arabs, but the Arabs are going to be increased because Palestinian refugees will be sweeping into the countries, according to this so-called right of return. Plus, there'll be demands, irredentist demands on the shrunken and shriveled Israel. And I say, no, wait. You know, in other words, they say it's, what did they say? They say it's two states, but not two peoples. One is fully for the Palestinians, and the other is split, but eventually will be taken over demographically by the Palestinians. And, you know, sometimes you have to call it like it is and say, that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. We want a real peace, a permanent peace, a defensible peace, but a peace above all in which the Palestinian leadership, not me, Palestinian leadership say to their own people, that is not going to happen. That middle ground has to disappear. That middle ground has to be taken up by courageous leaders who do what Sadat did vis-a-vis the Egyptian people, what the late King Hussein did to the people of Jordan. There has to be that kind of leadership on the Palestinian side. And I'm glad I've had the opportunity to bring this issue, as I'm bringing it up now, but to bring it into the peace process, because I think that's the essence of peace.
And you're prepared to walk the last mile?
That's a curious way to put it.
Why?
Well, it has the idea that...
Of death?
No, it has the idea of miles.
Okay. Of a roadmap, perhaps. Let me just stay with this idea, though, because I mean, I think we're onto something important, which is where is the struggle you have in your own being. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, you don't want to take chances.
That's right.
Because you don't believe there will be reciprocity. I mean, we're living here with this issue and this problem and this conflict that has been with us because people are afraid to take a chance for a better place because they don't trust the other guy. My question, how do you get past that kind of mistrust? That's what political leaders are about. That's what Yitzhak Rabin was about, and he paid a terrible price.
Without a doubt.
But
right. I think
that's what he was about.
I think it's a little more complicated than that, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that Immanuel Kant was right, the great German philosopher.
Right.
Because he said that the most critical observation that leaders have to make is that there are two kinds of peace in the world. There's peace with democracies and peace with dictatorships. He said that peace with democracies is automatic because most people don't want their sons and daughters to die in battlefields. So if they have anything to do with it, their government won't go to wars and certainly will not initiate wars. But he said that dictatorships don't have that limitation. So the only way that you're going to stop a dictatorship from going to war, he said, is to have the external force of deterrence or this force to roll back aggression if deterrence fails. The greatest catastrophes in history, the greatest tragedy in the history of my people and the history of the world occurred when leaders of democracies failed to distinguish what kind of peace they could have. And opposite the...
What kind of peace was achievable?
Well, they practiced the peace of democracies,
Yeah.
which is compromise and where defense doesn't count, opposite the greatest dictatorship of all times, Nazi Germany, and the result is catastrophe. Opposite the Soviet Union, they learned the lesson that they practiced the peace of deterrence. Now, the question is, what kind of entity do we have on the other side of the fence? If we get a dictatorship, like the Iranian-sponsored dictatorship
You're
of Hamas.
surrounded by dictatorships.
Well, authoritarian governments.
You were surrounded by them.
Authoritarian governments. But
Yeah.
we have arrangements, authoritarian governments, and some of them have
And you live in
remarkable...
peace with them.
And some of them have very courageous leaders. But we have to, nonetheless, we have security arrangements with those regimes. And the question is, what if we make a peace where we vacate territory to the Palestinians, and all of a sudden we wake up the next day and we find Iran's henchmen there? That's exactly what happened to us, not theoretically, it just happened in Gaza. And we've had rockets falling on our heads as a result of that. So when you say the Palestinians are building a civil society, they're building institutions of governance, they're building an economy, which we are supporting.
You're saying the same thing. You
I'm
believe
saying
this.
that's very important because it will decide what kind of peace we could have. But in the long run, in the foreseeable future, Israel will need to have, must have, the ability to defend itself because of the possibility of change, undesirable change in the territories adjacent to us. You know what it means adjacent to us? We're sitting in the heart of New York City. Skip JFK Airport. In LaGuardia Airport,
Right.
you already have the other side of Israel. So it's a tiny country. And so we have to make sure that on the other side
And that's the
we
burden
have...
you live with, but also you live with that burden, but you also live with the burden of history. And that cuts both ways, is that you have an opportunity to take risk that may possibly create a Palestinian state that's able to live.
I think it's
remove
possible.
the fear that Israeli citizens have lived with since 48.
Well,
You have that possibility.
Well, Charlie, let me tell you, it's my fondest dream. And I think it requires, it'll require a courageous partner on the Palestinian side as well. And it will require staying the hand of Iran that is using every power available to it to undermine the peace and to advance terror, not only from a distance, but close by
And they say
and within the
and they say
Palestinian.
it publicly, too.
Oh.
There's not even this is not something they're saying
Yes,
in
that's true.
private.
That's true.
So how long is your window before nuclear weapons are within reach and you have to say, we've given you the United States and we've asked you to find through negotiation or sanctions or something else a means of stopping Iran from having that
I don't think you
possibility?
can direct that question only to me because I think Iran poses certainly a grave danger to Israel, Charlie. But it represents an enormous danger to the Middle East and to the world. This is the premier sponsoring terrorist.
There is no state that I have talked to in the region that wants to see Iran have nuclear weapons. None.
Exactly.
Why did you go to Russia?
I don't confirm press rumors.
I mean, do you think the Russians are going to help you on this?
Well, I've spoken about this issue with all world leaders, and I think that it's important that everyone understand that Iran with nuclear weapons is a danger to us all.
And
I mean, can you imagine Iran that supplies terrorists with rockets and many other things, it would give them a nuclear umbrella, or worse, actually gave them access to nuclear weapons.
The Iranian government is at a weaker point than it was before the election, correct? What opportunity does that offer?
I think this regime is a lot weaker than people think. Overwhelmingly, the Iranian people have shown remarkable courage, detested. They stood up for freedom with a truly inspirational courage. If you have pressures, significant economic pressures on this regime, particularly the importation of gasoline, this could make the regime, might force the regime to choose whether it wants to advance the nuclear program or risk its own viability. It's not been put to that test. And I think there's a saying by Hillel the Elder, one of the great sages in Jewish history, who said 2,000 years ago, if not now, when? So I say, echoing Hillel, if not now, when are you going to apply those crippling sanctions? The time to do that is now. And I don't believe that the Iranian people will coalesce around a regime that detests. I think the opposite will happen. I think they'll applaud this pressure because they want to be relieved from this medieval regime, this violent theocracy that is oppressing them and threatening everyone else. I think you know from your visits in the region that just about every Arab leader will applaud, and so many others around the world
will applaud what?
Will applaud the effective imposition of sanctions on Iran. And I think time is short, and there's a lot of work to do.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much for taking time for this conversation. It's been a busy day for you, and I'm pleased you gave us this time.
Thank you, Charlie.
I make this note, this interview was recorded on Wednesday. The Prime Minister on Thursday, as we broadcast this, will have delivered his speech to the United Nations, the speech that we showed you excerpts from earlier. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.